Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and all else, to another episode of 3 Random Creepypastas, the show where I go on the Creepypasta wiki and find 3 random creepypastas to read. Well, let's do just that! 3 creepypastas, here we go! Alright, our very first story is known as Always Watching, which was added to the Creepypasta wiki by a user known as JewelMaster360. Wouldn't want to meet them on Rust. Let's take a look and see if Always Watching a Marble Hornet story is any good. Spoilers, it's not. Just kidding, let's see if Always Watching is a good story. Now, just as a forewarning in hindsight, this story deals with some very serious topics, very briefly, that being suicide, so if that is a topic that you are uncomfortable with at the moment or just do not want to hear about, do consider skipping this story or just clicking off this video. That will be completely alright, just so you know. It is very brief, but I just want to let you know just in case. Lizzie was a normal woman. She was in her late 30s, moderately pretty. She was single with no children and lived all alone in her little country house. She bought the house because it was in the middle of nowhere and that was what she preferred. Lizzie had anthropophobia, an irrational fear of people, and as a result, she was extremely antisocial. After moving in, Lizzie lived in the house completely normally. There was nothing strange or ominous about the house, other than the rumors that 11 out of the 14 previous owners had committed suicide in the house, but they were just stupid rumors. Rather concerning rumors, if I do say so myself, but I'm not here to judge. After 2.5 years of living there, Lizzie had a strange dream. It was not a nightmare, it was just odd. She dreamed that she was an infant, crying. She was in the arms of her father, and he was saying comforting words to her to soothe her. As Lizzie looked up at her father's face, she saw something disturbing. He had no eyes. He was not faceless, nor did he have dark, empty eye sockets. Where his eyes should have been, there was just skin. He continued to say comforting words and rocking her in his arms. Lizzie woke up. She was not frightened, but slightly disturbed. She shook off the dream, however, and continued her business as usual. A lot of these stories deal with eyes being messed with, which does make sense, as eyes are, the most expressive parts of the face. So, interesting that a lot of stories deal with that. Less than a month later, Lizzie had the exact same dream again with the same reaction. Mildly disturbed, she continued her life without further thought or concern. 4 weeks later, she had the dream again. The next time, it only took 2.5 weeks to occur. 1 week, 6 days, 4 days, 2 days. Then, the dream became a nightly occurrence for Lizzie. By now, she was genuinely scared. She began to dread going to sleep each night, afraid of having the dream. The dream itself was no more frightening than it originally was, but Lizzie was definitely afraid. A week after the nightmare became daily, she began to feel like she was being watched. It started out in small increments. She would start to get that feeling and she would look around, see nobody, and then feel at ease. But then it became constant. Everywhere Lizzie went, even out of the house, she felt like she was being watched. It got more and more intense as time went on, and the only relief she could get from the watching was when she distracted herself with reading, which was one of her favorite pastimes. The image of her eyeless father worked its way into Lizzie's waking hours as well. Whenever she closed her eyes, even for a moment, she saw it. His unmoving face haunted her every hour of the day. She eventually just refused to blink in fear of seeing his face again. It was nearly impossible, but she tried to keep her eyes open all of the time. She lost sleep, sometimes staying awake all night. She went broke, spending most of her money on coffee to stay awake. Still, the eyeless face continued watching. Always watching. One night, Lizzie was sitting at her kitchen table, desperately trying to stay awake and not blink. She began to doze off and her eyes closed. She saw a horrifying image of herself with no eyes, just like the vision of her father. Her face was covered with veins of red, with blood flowing from 2 wounds where her eyes should have been. The rest of her face appeared calm and emotionless. Even though her vision had no eyes, Lizzie could tell that it was looking straight at her. Lizzie screamed at the top of her lungs and tried to open her eyes, but they would not open. She panicked, pulling on her flesh, clawing at it until she could feel her own warm blood trickling down her face and hands. The vision persisted, still staring at her with absolute intent. Lizzie shouted, "Stop it! Stop watching me!" She started to sob uncontrollably and scream for help, even though nobody was within 10 miles of her house. "Somebody help me!" Lizzie crawled to the kitchen and fumbled in her drawer for a knife. She angrily thrust the knife into her right eye. The eyeless, bloodied face of herself continued to watch her unwavering. She slid the knife out and shoved the knife into her left eye and twisted it hard. The face continued watching. "Stop watching me!" screamed Lizzie. She shoved the knife into her chest and fell forward, cold, covered with blood, and finally free from the watching. John was just a normal guy. He was in his 50s when he moved into his little country house. There was nothing strange or ominous about the house, other than that the rumor that 12 out of the 15 previous owners had committed suicide in the house. But they were just stupid rumors. Alright, that was Always Watching. A brief short story, but I feel it did a lot with very little. For as short as the story was, I felt it was intriguing and interesting and quite disturbing at many points, especially when the author was describing the visions that Lizzie was having, and then how she stabbed herself and then ultimately committed suicide. Quite disturbing and interesting. And I am also intrigued by this house, was the house cursed? Was there something special about this house? Or the fact that not all of the previous owners committed suicide, is that implying that maybe only certain people are affected by the energies of the house or something? Interesting stuff. I did enjoy that. Yeah, that was a solid short horror story. It was intriguing. It put you in the shoes of Lizzie and made you feel the panic alongside her, with her staying awake, drinking coffee all the time, and trying not to blink. It's not very pleasant to think about, and I appreciate that the story went there and made you empathize with Lizzie in this situation. So ultimately, I enjoyed that story. I would give that a 7 out of 10. It was solid, it was good, and I really enjoyed it. I really did. All in all, Duel Master, good job. I liked your story, and do continue writing. With that said, let's find our second story. Alright, our second story is known as Emily's Basement, and it has a really creepy picture there attached to it. And this story was added to the Creepypasta wiki by a user known as Tristaber. Let's take a look. I mean, the picture is definitely creepy, so I hope the story is able to deliver on that. I awoke to bloodthirsty screams that morning, just like every morning. I actually had no idea if it was truly morning, but I always guessed it was. It sure felt like morning to me. I sat up from my bed and yawned softly, looking around the red-tinted room. The wails continued when I got out of bed, looking for the other human being in the room with me. No, the screaming didn't belong to this human. I already knew this. "Liz, are you awake?" the man's voice on the other end of the room asked. 2 stories with characters named Liz. I looked over, finding Richie standing there beside the cage. A smile spread across his face. She's already awake. Must be hungry. My throat went dry, nodding at him as I walked over. I felt nasty, my hair unwashed for months, and clothes being the same as I've worn for ages. I couldn't help but shudder as I heard Richie snickering. I always felt like he was laughing at my suffering, laughing at my fear. I finally reached the cage, kneeling down to peer into the bars. The figure inside was curled into the far left corner, screaming at the bars as if it was her only way to survive. The screams made me feel so sorry for her, but it was only for a moment until I remembered the horrors that happened to anyone who entered the cage. Richie's hand soon touched my shoulder, causing me to stand back up and look at him. He looked about as dirty as I felt, both of us covered in small bloodstains and dirt. "This is an unpleasant job for you, I know, but someone has to do it." His voice was almost sympathetic, but my hatred for him could not die down. I just wanted to leave this basement, be normal again, find my home, and forget about the things that happened inside of that cage. I know, was all I could say to him before turning around and looking around the small red room. The room was red because of the dim lighting and also because blood stained every wall. Bodies of the other people who had worked on this project with us hung from the ceiling by hooks, skin and body parts torn or cut off of them. Some of those bodies had been mutilated by my own hands. These people were once my friends, people who had helped me throughout this nightmare, but since they turned against Richie, he had them killed and used as either food for the girl in the cage or material to make the girl better. Richie was the only one who could add anything to her. My job was to feed her. To feed the rotting, screaming, living lump of flesh that has caused me so many nightmares. I walked over to one of the hanging bodies, grimacing when I saw the flesh had been invaded by maggots. Not a huge surprise since the bodies were usually invaded by the baby flies after a while. I put on my mask to cover my face from the rotting smell and began to cut into the flesh. I felt tears fill my eyes, remembering that this body had once been my sister, who had gone into this project with me. If only I hadn't talked her into coming with me, she wouldn't be here getting eaten away by maggots and that damned thing in the cage. I finally got a good slab of rotted meat from the corpse and carried it to Richie, who was kneeling by the cage and talking to the screaming girl like she was a newborn baby. I couldn't help but growl softly to myself, hatred building up inside of me as I neared Richie and that monster. "I have the food," I said softly, holding out to show him. Richie only nodded and kept the girl inside distracted. Quietly, I did my job. I opened the cage door, trying not to alert her that I was opening it. If I did, she could get out again, and Richie would rather avoid that. Although, the bodies from the aftermath were used to evolve the girl into something more grotesque. As the cage door opened slowly, the girl continued to look at Richie. I swallowed hard and tried to quietly put the flesh inside, but I froze. Looking up, I saw her staring at me now, and so was Richie. My heartbeat quickened as they both just stared at me, unmoving. But what made my blood run cold was when Richie spoke. "Yes, Emily," he said softly to the girl-like monster. "This is your mother." I quickly took my head out of the cage and fell back to the ground, staring at the opening of the cage with wide eyes. I cursed myself for not closing it as I saw the girl inside slowly crawl to the opening. This was the first good look of her I've seen, my eyes unable to look away from her. Her eyes were stitched wide open and black like the night sky. Her nose was non-existent, and mouth halfway stitched closed. The other half of her mouth was made into a wide smile, and the teeth were filed into little sharp knives. The posture she had was like an animal, and the way she crawled showed every single deformed bone that was wrapped in other people's skin. How was she alive? "Mama?" the girl said in a raspy, scratchy tone, as if nails were being scraped on a chalkboard soaked in concrete. I flinched at the name she gave me, instantly looking away from her. Richie put his hand on the girl's head. "Mama looks scared." Richie patted her head softly. "Liz, calm down. Emily won't hurt you. You've cared for her, haven't you?" He sounded as if this was a real child we were talking about, as if she wasn't a man-eating monster. "Emily just needs a mom and dad." "Emily, wasn't that the name of—" I cut off, my eyes darting from Emily to Richie. "Your daughter." "Our daughter now, Liz," he said softly, taking his hand off Emily's. The creature began to crawl towards me again, causing me to scream and frantically move away from her, kicking my legs violently. "Liz!" Richie screamed. "You'll upset her if you act like this!" I shook my head quickly, tears streaming down my face as I scrambled away from the horrifying beast. Emily made a soft sigh, which soon turned into a growl. That was it. That was it for me. In the matter of seconds, I was once again on my feet, running to the door of the basement, attempting to leave, but Richie was already there blocking my escape. "We could be a family!" he shouted. In panic mode, I grabbed the nearest pipe and slammed it against his head. A sickening crunch echoed through the small red room. Before I even checked to see if he was dead, I opened the door with my spare key and ran as fast as I could. The bright light of the sun blinded me for a few moments, the fresh air making me slightly dizzy. Before I could leave it, I began stumbling forward out of the dreaded house. I had left every door I passed through open, but I didn't care. I had seen the sun again. I had smelled the trees again. I was alive again. And right then, I heard the monster named Emily charge out of the basement with the speed of a starving wolf and charge right into me. I fell harshly to the ground and stared at her, tears once again forming in my eyes. Her disgusting breath tickled my cheek as she leaned close to me, sniffing my flesh and hair. She bared her teeth and locked eyes with me, giving me a wide, toothy grin that chilled me to the bone, and with a blink of an eye, she lunged forward, and things went black. Next was light. White, blinding light against my sun-deprived skin. I squinted and sat up, looking around to see no signs of anyone or anything. Not even the cabin was there. I had shrugged it off and got up to run back towards home. The home I could barely remember, but still had warm memories of. I dreamed maybe I could go back and get help, tell everyone of the horrors I went through, and maybe they would get me the help I needed. Therapy, maybe even a detective to investigate the cabin if I could find it again. Maybe I could write a book. All the thoughts of home and my future ran through my head as I made my way back, stumbling and holding my stomach. But when I got into the city, everything was way too different. I didn't get it at first. Why it was that when I got back to civilization, no one recognized me. No one looked at me and asked me why I was filthy. No one even looked at me or spoke to me. Why? Why is it not a single person noticed something was wrong? I was about to scream for help, grab someone and ask them why it was they were ignoring me. Until I saw her. Emily stood, the best she could anyway, in the middle of the sidewalk. So many people passed her, but not a single person glanced at her. They all avoided her like a river going around a rock. And as they were ignored by every living creature around us, we made eye contact, and I realized how lonely I was going to be. Holy shit, dude! That was Emily's basement. Really, really intense. Disturbing, gross, unsettling, really, really well written, and in my opinion, absolutely fantastic. That is an 8 bordering on a 9 out of 10. Not gonna lie, while reading that story, I was thinking, is this gonna be my first 10 out of 10? I mean, I don't know if I want to go that far, but definitely a 9 out of 10, because that story, with its concepts and the way it was describing this disturbing and disgusting creature, really got to me. It really got to me. And, you know, the picture used in the story also helped with the atmosphere, really making it feel dark and dingy and gross, and the way the author was describing how they had turned her sister and her friends into food for this creature, and then that final twist ending, which seems to imply that maybe the main character is existing on like a different plane of existence or something, or they're dead or in purgatory or something like that. I'm not really sure at this moment, but I really, really enjoyed that concept of, you know, her being stuck with this creature, you know, them being the only ones who are able to interact, while everyone else, you know, can't see them or are just flat out ignoring them. Really enjoyed that. All in all, I found that story to be fantastic, and I really, really, really got into it. I don't know if you could tell, but while I was narrating that, I was getting into the story, man. That was absolutely fantastic, and I really, really enjoyed it. So all in all, definitely a 9 out of 10 for me, in my opinion. I really enjoyed that. That was right up my alley. Really liked it. Really found the description of this Emily creature really disturbing, and also the fact that Richie seemed to want to almost like reanimate his dead daughter or something. Really, really creepy and disturbing to think about. And the way that that she was like comprised of different parts of their friends. Ooh, really, really grisly to think about. Good stuff. Really like that. With that said, I think that should be that for our second story. Let's find our third and final story. Alright, our third and final story is known as My Great Grandmother Left Me Her Home, which was added to the Creepypasta Wiki by Clazomania45. We've had some pretty good luck so far, so let's see if we can finish it off with a great third story. My great grandmother left me her home when she died. She was an old lady, about 93 or so, when she passed away from ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. It was surprising that she'd lived so long, really. She had had cancer since I was 5 or 6, and I'm 29 now. I never really knew her much because she rarely left her house, and because of the fact that my mother didn't like her. She was my dad's grandmother, but he wasn't ever around. Always out working for a trucking company or something. All I really did know is that she was exceptionally wealthy. So when she left me her house in her will, let's just say I was surprised. I rolled my 1996 Nissan Sentra into the driveway of her house and wasn't really surprised with its appearance. The house looked like it was 100 years old, and I could smell that old house smell all the way from my car. I opened the door of my Sentra and got out. Then I proceeded to walk up the porch of the old house. It was wooden and had thick boards slathered with paint that was chipped off and revealed the old 2x4s underneath. When I made my way up the door and turned the knob, I pushed open the door and peered inside. I feel like there should have been a comma there instead of a period. It was dark inside, darker than I expected it to be. I slid my hand along the wall until I found the light switch and flicked it on. The lights in the kitchen flickered on, and I looked around inside. The walls had peeling wallpaper on them, and everything smelled like I expected it to. I walked deeper into the house and tossed my Madras ski jacket onto the table. I settled in the living room and sat down on the couch. It was old and smelled like shoe leather. But it was comfortable. Extremely comfortable. I stretched out on the couch and turned the television on with an old remote. The television, which was one of those old ones with an antenna on it, flickered to life with a little bit of static. A black and white cartoon played on the television, but I changed channels so fast to see anything on it. I flicked around through these channels for a while until I finally found the news. I left the TV on while I went to get my bags. It took me about half an hour to finally get settled in. After I did, I laid back on the couch and felt sleep begin to wrap around me like the loving arms of my mother and passed out on the couch. I woke up in a cold sweat after sleeping for what felt like 10 minutes. I had had a nightmare, I thought. It had to be a nightmare. When I was younger, I always had them, and it wasn't a big deal. I thought I just outgrew them. But this one was oddly specific and weird. It started with me walking down into the basement of the house I was in, and finding my dying great-grandmother there. She was hooked up to a life support machine and had the signature beep of a heart monitor coming from her chest. My great-grandmother rose her hand up at me, called out something I didn't quite hear. A light flashed in front of me and my grandmother was gone, replaced by a single leg bone on the bed she was laying in. And then I woke up. I dabbed my face with a dry rag after that and tried to fall back asleep, but I couldn't. I quite clearly wasn't going to be sleeping after that. So I don't know why I even tried, but I did. I felt like I was being watched when I left the living room and heard a faint whispering going off in my ear every time I left the living room. I hadn't noticed it when I walked in, so I figured I was just hallucinating, but it seemed real. I tried fixing myself a Hot Pocket and stayed in the kitchen while it cooked. The whispering was slowly getting louder, or at least it seemed like it was. I don't know what came over me, but when I looked at the wallpaper, I began to, slowly but surely, slide an old knife out of the knife rack from beside me whilst the Hot Pocket continued to simmer, like I was being controlled by some force other than myself. I stabbed the knife into the walls and passed straight through the wallpaper. I stabbed again and again and again. I stabbed until there were at least 100 holes in the wallpaper, and it had gotten loose. Then I slid my hand into the hole I'd made, that was the largest, and tightened my fingers around a dry sphere in the wall. I jerked it out of the wallpaper and stared into its eyeless sockets. I'd pulled a skull out of the wall. A real... God, it just made me sick just thinking about it. I called the cops after that happened and they investigated the house. They told me they found at least 30 or 40 complete human skeletons hidden in the walls and the crawl space, and a satanic ritual site in the basement. I'd gotten off on the wrong path on the way to my great-grandmother's house, and had invaded the house of a serial killer who lived 2 miles out of the woods. They didn't tell me much, and I never moved back into my great-grandmother's house. I sold her house to my parents the next month after I had had this experience, and moved out of the country cabin I had been living in. That was a very surprising twist, I will have to say. Rather sudden, if I'm gonna have to be honest here. Very sudden, you know, oh, turns out it was a satanic ritual, and there were like a bunch of different human skeletons here. But I mean, otherwise, aside from some weird, like, I saw some weird punctuation sometimes, some weird phrasings or whatever, and some areas where I feel like there should have been a comma instead of a period and stuff like that. But overall, I would say that story was pretty good. I would have liked a little more, because, as I said, you know, the ending felt rather sudden. It felt like a huge whiplash, in my opinion, and I felt that a lot of the detail in the beginning of the story could have been cut for a bit, because I didn't feel like a lot of it had any real effect on the rest of the story, and I didn't really understand why the dream had to be included. I mean, I did enjoy the description of this really sad and traumatic dream that the main character had. I guess the vision of this human bone could have foreshadowed the human skeletons on the walls later, but I don't know. I felt that there was some unnecessary detail in the story, even though it was rather short. So in some ways, I wanted a little more from the story, but in other aspects, I wanted a little less, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm contradicting myself here, but that's at least what I'm thinking of at the moment. I mean, it wasn't a bad story at all, and it had some interesting concepts in it, and I did enjoy a lot of the writing, and I found the concept to be interesting. You know, inheriting a house from someone who you didn't really know, and then you get there, and you know something horrible goes wrong while you're on your own. So that was pretty cool. Overall, you know, like I said, would have liked a little more in some aspects, a little less in others. Overall, this story, I'm leaning towards a 6 out of 10, which is, you know, slightly above average, because I did enjoy the story. I did enjoy it, and I found the writing to be quite good at times. Like I said, ending was a little too sudden for my liking, and it wasn't perfect, so probably a 6 out of 10. If on a good day, probably a 7 out of 10, but I think I'm gonna leave it for now at a 6 out of 10. It was good, but not perfect in my opinion. So yeah, that's basically all I want to say about this and every other story. And those were 3 random creepypastas. I sure hope you enjoyed listening to them as much as I enjoyed reading them. There was no story here that I felt was bad or just average. I enjoyed all 3 stories. But with that said, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and comment your thoughts down below. Don't forget to also subscribe. Check out my social medias for updates and stuff like that. Or my Patreon page if you want to support the channel directly. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay awesome. Goodbye.